Hi, we're going to talk about how to create a tidy data set. Now, the rules that we're going to talk about within this presentation exist and have existed for quite some time. The term tidy data, however, comes from Wickham, who has created a library in R called Tidyverse, and if your data is set up in this way, then it facilitates working in the Tidyverse world. That said, setting your data up in this way is going to be valuable no matter what tools you end up using to analyze your data. So this is good practice whether you're planning to use Tidyverse in R or not. Okay, so let's start by thinking about how we set the actual data up, and the very first thing I'm going to say is do not use multiple header rows. So for example here, which is what we want you to do, row 1 is just the variable names, whereas in this example row 1 and 2 are actually containing variable names. And the reason for this is simple. All stats packages are going to import the data and they assume that only the top row is a header row. Okay, and so if you have multiple rows that have variable names, the stats package cannot cope with that. Now, the reason a lot of people will set their data up like this is that is to facilitate making their data entry easier. The reality is, if you follow some of the rules about how to enter data in the tips video that is also available, you'll see that doing that's not necessary. When it comes to naming the variables, this is where things can get a little bit tricky, and it sort of comes to being a little bit of an art form. I think it's really important that you go for the shorter names. 10 to 12 characters would be an absolute max, and the reason for that is simple. You have to type them each time you want to call them, so you don't want long variable names. Start with a letter rather than a number. Again, the reason for that is around how code works, and some code packages cannot cope with numbers being at the beginning, so just don't do it. Don't contain any blank spaces, and that's what the example below there has. The right way to do it is to call it cat.id or cat_id, not cat identification number with spaces all through there. Okay, and the reason for that is most packages will think that you're calling for a variable called cat, a variable called identification, and a variable called number, and so they won't be able to manage. I've also got a final thing there about using date or ID, and so you'll notice we didn't just call it ID, we called it cat ID, and the reason for that is the word ID is a reserved word in many statistical languages, similarly as is date. And so basically if variables are called date or ID, they will actually call functions in code. They won't actually ever be able to be called variable names, so just avoid that. So just to reiterate, one single header row, use short descriptive names, no more than 10 characters, start with a letter not a number, don't have blank spaces, and don't use date or ID on their own. Okay, so the next thing to be mindful of is you really do need to start that data entry in the cell A1. Okay, don't start down 1, cross 1, or as has been done here, a down 1 and a cross 1, both of them. It must start in A1 because when this package, whatever statistical software you're using, that is where they expect the first bit of data to be. So respect that and set your data up in that way. Now we get into potentially controversial. Some people will disagree with this. My rule around missing data is always enter an NA or a non-plausible number. So if it was weights, for example, then I would put -99. Okay, and also make sure that if a value is 0, that you enter 0 rather than leaving it blank. So here is an example of a whole series of identification numbers. There are some other things that are wrong with this sheet, but you can see that right here we've got all of this blank there, and we're left wondering, was it missing or was it 0? And so when I got this data set and I went back, and the person who sent it to me actually couldn't remember what the story was, and they had to go back and for nearly 150 records check what it was. So for that reason, I always recommend that if it is a 0, you enter a 0, and if it is a missing, to avoid any confusion later on, that you enter an NA or a non-plausible number. Okay, and that just means that when the data set comes in, you don't end up going backwards and forwards having to double check that your blanks are in fact missing or were they 0. Don't leave blank columns between variables. People like to again space them out, as was done here, so you can see the F has been left blank. One of the main reasons for that is people want to make it easier for them to enter their data, but if we follow the rules of good data entry, then we don't need to worry about that. Don't store multiple data tables in the same spreadsheet. Each row should represent a unique observation. So here we can see that we've got the cat identification here and their weight, and then over here we've got information about each cat. What you need to do is keep these in separate spreadsheets, okay? And you will link them through this cat identification number, but you don't need to have them in the same spreadsheet to be able to do that. Don't store multiple pieces of information. So here we have, in this one example, one of them was measured in pounds and the rest were measured in kilograms. But what they did wrong here was that they put 5.6 and kg and 7.8 and lb. So those two pieces of information are stored in that weight variable, and we can't work with the data that way. However, if the unit that was used was stored separately, we could actually create a new variable which converted everything into kilograms if we needed to. Don't enter comments and embed key pieces of information with comments. So this example here is we've got a whole series of information about what is a 0, what is missing is blank. That's Carolyn's preferred way, so I'm showing you here that, you know, we do differ. I used to do that. I don't anymore because I'm never 100% sure what missing is, so I always note it as an NA. We do need to store this information, but this is not the right way to do it, and we're going to show you in a little bit how to do that. Don't use color coding. This is my special fonts or text formatting. So in this case, we've got all of these are different colors, and actually, you know, it would be fine if all they were different colors for some reason, but sometimes what people would do is store the colors mean something. So for example, these could be all the cases were red, right? And they don't have a variable that says was it a case or control. Now when we import that data into an Excel spreadsheet, into a stats package, it doesn't care that red meant it was a case. All right, so don't use colors and special fonts to have special meanings. Okay. Don't merge cells. This is another one that people love to do. Again, it's about making it look pretty. The fact is we end up with very, very boring spreadsheets when we work in a tidyverse. We don't want any of that because, again, it comes down to the stats package doesn't know what to do with this one. It doesn't know that the cat ID one relates to all of those, so just drag it down. Don't use special characters, so commas, asterisks, dollar signs. They all create problems in different stats packages. Avoid them. You might want to create in Excel the format option to look at these with spacings, and that's just like a mask that changes how it looks. It doesn't change the underlying value, so don't go and put a comma in there because it's not going to go in properly. If you really want to see your spreadsheet with commas, use the format option. So to reiterate, when you do a format change in Excel, it doesn't actually change the data underneath. All it does is change how it looks to you. Okay, so it's a really nice tool. You can change how it looks in Excel without changing the data. So a number of times people will say to me, oh, well, that's really good, but I'm just working with my 30 data points and it's fine, I've done it now, I don't want to undo it, and blah, blah, blah. So the first thing I would say to you is ideally you've spoken to someone before you've started entering data as to what the best way is and formatting that data. So the thing is about these rules is that they do save you time. When you come back to the data after a really long week, trying to remember what the color coding means, what this means, what that means, I can guarantee it's going to take you longer to get into it. Whereas if you set your data sheets up nice and clean, it really does make working out what's what. You also never know when you're going to need a stats person's help. Okay, the number of times someone has come to me and they've come to me with messy data and I say, look, I can't do anything with this data until it's reformatted, and that either falls to me to do, in which case if it's a paid consultancy it's costing them more money, or if it's, you know, being done as kind of a favor for someone, well, instead of me starting analyzing the data and giving them the results, I might have to spend 5 or 6 hours structuring the data in the right way, which could mean that you wait 2 to 3, 4, 5 weeks before I get another 2 to 3 hours to actually do the analysis you need. The other thing is that a lot of the times if you're actually out collecting data, that data can be useful to other people, so make it easy to hand over to someone else at the point in time when you're most familiar with it. And sort of on that vein comes the thing of, you know, if you publish something or you submit your thesis for examination and someone comes back with questions, going back, you know, 2 months after you've submitted your thesis and trying to work out what was what is really difficult. So, you know, that person you're handing over to could actually be yourself in 2 months' time, so make life easy.